Who's listening to your phone calls? Presumably with the authorisation of the Prime Minister here in Downing Street, the British surveillance agency GCHQ has secretly accessed fibre optic cables carrying huge amounts of internet and communications data, according to documents disclosed by whistleblower Edward Snowden. The agency has phone call and email data collected from innocent people and can store that for up to 30 days so that they can analyse it under an operation codenamed Tempora. The Investigatory Powers Act, also known as the Snooper's Charter, represents a massive extension of the surveillance powers of the state. It requires internet companies to keep customers' web traffic history for 12 months. It also gives spying agencies and the police the ability to conduct the mass hacking of IT infrastructures, personal computers, smartphones, and any electronic device. Whistleblower Edward Snowden labelled this as the most extreme surveillance in the history of Western democracy. It goes further than many autocracies. In 2013, surveillance officials stormed the headquarters of The Guardian newspaper. Then, British officials arrived at The Guardian's offices, demanding the immediate surrender of all information relating to the whistleblower Edward Snowden. The Guardian management claimed a substantial public interest in revealing the scale of government surveillance and the collaboration with technology and telecoms companies. Yet, perhaps surprisingly, the general public have not taken a militant or active role in objections to such state interference in the free press. Is it important to spy on the public? And why don't people object more strongly to surveillance by the state? Simple questions with important answers. Britain has accused Russia of using foreign spies in the UK and attempting to influence the Brexit referendum. Russia has also accused the UK of using foreign spies. Why do countries use foreign spies in the first place? We invited the public here in London to comment. Here's what they said.
Basically, it's depending on the security terminologies. Like, to be frank, I prefer that every country should have their spies, because there are certain regions like you cannot get directly in the details in depth in I don't get that particular word, but there are certain places like the secret agents can only get in and get out the details, and it's just for the safety of the population and the citizens. So I think countries should have their spies, yeah.
In general, obviously, we need to have a sort of environment of transparency and whatnot. So, there shouldn't really be a need for spies. But, unfortunately, that's, I guess, how governments work. I wish we could move to a place where it wasn't necessary.
I guess they're necessary. You've got to have information on what other people are thinking and saying about you, haven't you, as a state, as a nation?
To get to investigate intelligence against each other, to find out what's going on each other as well, so they know how to look at things on each other.
From history, we know that countries have always spied on each other. It's always been a spy game between nations to try and one-up each other on security or on trying to find out what the other country is up to, sort of to gain some kind of knowledge or, in a way to find out if they can better the country in some way, or to store up information to use later in some way. If we look at history, even the programs about World War I and World War II and all the spying that went on in that time. So it always has a place in history.
It appears to be necessary, yes. I don't know how much of this country does in terms of espionage involved with Russia, but it appears that Russia does.
I think it depends on the country. I think in Russia's situation, with a lot of paranoia and difficult international situation, you can understand maybe why, but doesn't mean it's justified, but there is a basis behind it.
Well, all countries use foreign spies, and there's two purposes. Number one is to gather political intelligence on behalf that is value to their country. So they have spies in different countries to gather secret political intelligence which can be of useful to the country and for their foreign policy. And then secondly, in a more operational level, they use foreign spies to mount operations. And in the old days, during the Cold War, they would organize coups, sometimes assassination. Now it's about information. So now they use foreign spies to disrupt the country through black propaganda, misinformation, use of fake news. And so those are the two main uses of foreign spies.
Spying is as old as man. It's nothing new. If you go back 1,000 years, spies were in various monarchies across Europe and other parts of the world. As to the question on spying in this country by Russia, there's always been an undertone of Russophobia here, where if they don't have anyone else to blame, they will blame the big bad Russians. So spying is nothing new. Every country does it. It's not solely Russia doing it. It's not solely Britain doing it. Every country has their own objectives and their own aims.
Do people here in central London believe that spying on the general public is essential for keeping law and order? And why? Here's what they told us.
There can be some threats to security sometimes, but at the same time, I think, we should all be given the right to privacy.
I think it's more important to have a culture that encourages not doing harmful things to other people than spying on them to enforce that. Yeah, I think it's a fear tactic, it's a scare tactic against people.
I think it is to an extent, because you have so many people doing many bad things, I should say. So therefore, a bit of it is good.
I don't think it's a good thing in general, and it should just be limited to certain emergency situations, say. So if there is an actual threat that there might be, say some terrorist attack, or then the parliament might specifically allow for strict, some surveillance. But in general, it shouldn't be. Mass surveillance should never be allowed, I think.
No, I don't believe it's necessary keeping order. Not in this country, anyway.
Well, I think it depends on what you mean by the public. I mean, obviously it's legitimate to spy on terrorists, but on criminals, on people who are literally planning bombing or planning attacks that can damage the public. The issue is how you find that intelligence, and you may have to use surveillance operations against large numbers of people to find the small number of people who are the terrorists. The issue is not so much the spying, the issue is how they use that intelligence, and do they use it for improper purposes.
There's certainly an argument for it. Every ideology and every regime, if you will, has involved itself in various techniques such as this. As to whether or not it's moral is another question. The age-old saying, if you've got nothing to hide, then don't fear, comes to mind. I personally don't subscribe to that belief. I believe people do have a right to some privacy, but at the end of the day, every state in the world wants to protect its interests. Now, what I would say is Britain is engaging itself in spying on its own citizens. Now, that's all well and good, but it has the gall to point its finger at other nations that do exactly the same. So if they're going to do it, the saying and the expression, what is good for the goose is good for the gander, comes to mind.
British intelligence from spying on Syrian government troop movements has been shared with Takfiri militants to assist attacks on Syrian government forces. Why is the British intelligence community involved in such activities? Here's the public's view.
Just to maintain their power. That's the basic answer, I can say that. And if they don't do it, then, maybe the Islamic states or these other countries might, do something which might affect the Britain or UK government. That's why.
I'm from South Africa, and I think there's a very big colonial kind of narrative that sort of comes out even today. And I think it's a huge problem that, we talk a lot about democracy and a lot about, self-determination for countries, but people don't really allow that to happen in practice. Sometimes it's because of people want specific resources, or it's about power and consolidation.
Yeah, I think we've had too much involvement in the Middle East for sure, and spying is definitely a big part of that. but also the armed forces being there at all, I think, is perhaps too much.
It's a bit more different in Syria, I guess, in general, because if there's a war, then I can see how like collecting intelligence might be helpful to resolve the war. I don't know, but yeah. So I think military intelligence is different from civil intelligence, but that should be regulated as well. I guess there should be some international consensus on what is allowed when it comes to war intelligence. I don't know, yeah.
I think this Middle East issue has always been a complex one. And I think governments sort of do things that they think are helpful at the time. But really, maybe sometimes they don't think too much about the bigger consequences or later consequences of their actions and the like. But, I don't know. If it's helpful in some way, then they have to do what they have to do. But if it's not going to be helpful, it's not going to help the people on the ground, the locals, the people who are suffering and all kinds of stuff, then what's the point? If it's just to like group each other up and be like, yeah, we're stronger than you, we're tougher than you, we got more power than you, and that kind of thing, and not really bring out any good progress out of it, then what's the point?
Well, again, I'm not sure to what degree we do, but we obviously do to a certain extent, but presumably to keep pace with our commitments to our allies.
Well, I'm not familiar with this particular operation where British intelligence is sharing this information, but I think they would probably justify it on the basis of the atrocities by the Syrian government, militia aided by Russia against Syrian civilians. But I think also there's a whole history of intelligence agencies all over the world, in every country, having alliances with people that they wouldn't necessarily approve of. At the end of the Second World War, both the British and the American intelligence agencies recruited Nazis as intelligence agents to spy on Russia. So it's not something you would like to do, but in the intelligence world, sometimes you have to make unsavory alliances.
Well, the British state and the objectives of Takfiri militants align at various times and have done over the last 2 decades. And even before that, you could argue. They have the same objectives at times. They often go skewed, and that's what happens when they end up throwing these Takfiris in jail or killing them. But at times, and certainly in Syria for the time being, the objectives of both Britain and these militants align. So they're going to share not all of their intelligence, but what they want them to know, because at the moment they have the same goal, to remove Assad from power.
The figures tell the story. The Guardian newspaper claims last year GCHQ handled 600 million telephone events each day, had tapped more than 200 fibre optic cables, and could process data from at least 46 of them at a time. Home Office figures confirm that in 2014 there were 517,236 authorizations of requests for communications data from the police and other public bodies, and a further 2,765 interception warrants authorized by ministers.
Regulations known as the Snooper's Charter were described as the most extreme surveillance in the history of Western democracy. These give spying agencies and the police the powers and ability to conduct the mass hacking of IT infrastructures, personal computers, smartphones, and any electronic device. Why are British citizens not reacting to this? We asked them.
I don't prefer that anybody would be, getting my personal data and all the stuff. But I don't prefer, if personally asked, that I would also offend that thing that I cannot give my privacy to anyone else out there. That's why.
I think people have become a bit complacent because the way the internet functions already, we all kind of know that our data is being used without our consent sometimes, or we give consent through jargon, like they give us this legal jargon and then we end up saying yes, but we don't really know what we're agreeing to. And so I think it's just a kind of complacency. And at the same time, people feel like, I get to use all these services online for free. if I give my data, and so they sort of see like there's some kind of benefit, but it's the how do you say, the loss overall is quite big. And I think it's just a lack of understanding of how it impacts people. We probably need to be a lot more upset about it, I think.
I think we're just immune to it. I mean, you see CCTV cameras everywhere and you just don't think about it. But at the same time, I don't think it's being talked about enough.
Well, I think the British public, we tend to be a bit passive. We tend to be a bit passive about things. But then again, it's like, what's the threat? What's the threat? Is the government... I mean, it would be... I guess some people are afraid, and there's a little bit of fear in that it can end up being like, like in the movies where like the government then ends up controlling an entire society and that kind of thing. I can think sometimes people are afraid of that. But sometimes I think, what's the real threat to people? If you're not doing anything illegal, what's the real threat? To your life, what's the real threat? What's the government going to do to you? And the like, unless somebody can come up with something that they sort of know that, okay, this is how they're using your information and this is what they're doing that is wrong and should be illegal. And the like, if the government itself is threatening the people's safety in some way by behaving the way that they do, then they should be held accountable for that.
I'm not sure if he was commentating on what happens for this country, but I think comments were mainly about the American system. Presumably ours are something similar. I think that there is people do react and people do voice concerns about the issues that he was raising.
Honestly, I didn't know about this until around a year ago or so, and even then it was via reading about it of my own accord, not it being told to me. So it's just not in the news, I suppose.
Do you think it should be?
Yeah, it was quite a while ago that the Snooper's Charter was put into place.
It went into law in November.
As in this November. Surprised I hadn't heard about it.
Well, I think the British public are not reacting for two reasons. One, they've had experience of bombings, shootings, atrocities where ordinary British people are being shot and killed on the streets of London. And I think they're willing to pay the price of that kind of mass surveillance. And quite frankly, if your phone is being intercepted and you've got nothing to hide, why should you worry about surveillance? And secondly, I think in Britain, and certainly to my knowledge, British intelligence agencies are governed by law. There are laws in terms of they can't just go around hacking into or putting people under surveillance just if they feel like. They have to get a warrant. There's a certain amount of accountability. Whereas in the old days, a long time ago, they would just bug whoever they liked.
First question is, does your average Brit in the street know it's even going on? Those that do would proclaim they don't really have anything to hide, so wouldn't care. They would assume that the harvesting of this data is going to be used against, if you will, Islamist types, terrorism, etc. But the truth is, what are they really doing this for? It's already illegal for those people to be engaged in uploading terrorist content online, for instance. This is actually going against political activists here, people engaging in, if you will, dissenting from the state. So I will pose a question, why is this being put forward? Now, the ruling class here, the British state, have lost control of the political narrative in this country. People used to consume their media 20, 30 years ago through the newspapers owned by barons and the BBC. Now they're getting on social media, and the likes of Theresa May want to retake control of that because they have lost control of that very narrative.
The government's communications headquarters is able to tap into and store data, including phone calls and emails, between innocent people from the fibre optic cable network for up to 30 days so that it can be analysed under an operation codenamed Tempora. What are the public's thoughts on this?
Actually, they are doing it at the moment, but there are certain leakages, I might say, I just had a word with my friends out regarding this topic. If we put some certain search on Google or something or any other thing, if we are talking, our phone is aside, and if we are talking regarding certain, let's say, a policy, if we want to buy a policy, then all of a sudden from the very next day or within 2-3 days you get the pop-ups showing regarding that thing, but we haven't searched it yet, or we just had a word while our phone was aside. But I mean, to say like the companies are already tracking us down, and it is our privacy is getting affected due to it. And I don't prefer that government should store my data, but still it's a concern of security. Then I might say if they are doing it, then let them preserve the data. That's it. If they don't exploit it, then it's good.
It's weird, but I know that my data is already out there. I mean, we put so much of ourselves online on Facebook. People put so much on YouTube. So I mean, obviously I feel worried about it, but what can I do? It just seems like the nature of the internet these days, and because it's such a new technology, we don't really realize the repercussions of it. So I think in the next few years there's going to have to be a lot of change with the law around the internet.
It's scary, isn't it? It's it doesn't fill me with confidence. I don't trust the guys at Westminster any more than I'd trust the guy in the street hacking my phone and looking at what was on there. So yeah.
I think that's where the issue comes into, because then you got people like Snowden, people who hack into the government files and steal people's information and expose it, and the like. And that's where the issue is, where if the government cannot guarantee people's safety, the information of people's, the safety of people's information, then they shouldn't be storing it. They shouldn't be storing it for a month, maybe a week, but not a month. But because you got hackers who hack the government, so the government itself, if they can't guarantee the safety of their own information, right, then they shouldn't be keeping anybody else's information, because that's where the problems come in, of hackers from all over the world. Like we had that situation, the person who hacked the NHS and all the banks and things like that, and brought the country to a standstill. It's like, if the government can't protect people, its own organizations from such things, then how can they protect people from such things if they're keeping the information?
I don't know what situations the government would use it in. Again, this is not something I know much about, so I don't know what purpose it has for this, if it's used for criminal purposes, if it's used for like ordinary purposes. But it is a bit distressing to hear about.
Well, I'm obviously concerned if GCHQ and the British intelligence agencies are snooping and interfering in the lives of ordinary people. But as I understand it, it's a potential use, it's not an actual use. So they have the power to do it. That doesn't necessarily mean they're actually doing it. And also, again, if you've got nothing to hide, then you shouldn't be too concerned by that. But I also think it's not about whether they're putting people under surveillance and gathering intelligence. The real issue is, how are they using that intelligence? If they're using that intelligence, so for example, blacklist people or stop people getting a job or disrupting their lives or interfering in a real tangible way, that's the real issue. The fact that they have these surveillance operations is not necessarily a problem, it's how they use the intelligence.
People will presume it doesn't impact them because they have nothing to hide, but at the end of the day, what are they going to be using this data for? Who are they going to be targeting with it? Whose calls are they taking? But we have to remember, we'd be very naive to assume that this hasn't been going on always. They may have been doing this in the past in different techniques. The British state has kept an eye on its population since time immemorial. It's nothing new. These measures, if you will, are just legitimizing it. If you don't think the security services are up to their neck engaging in all sorts of illegal measures going against their own state, we'd be foolish to think that. This here essentially just gives them the power to rubber stamp it, if you will.
Under the new laws, security services will be legally empowered to bug computers and phones upon approval of a warrant, and companies will be legally obliged to assist these operations and bypass encryption where possible. This could include everything from phone conversations to NHS health records.
We know the UK spies on its own citizens and sends spies around the world. We also know that the new powers to do so are being extended to levels previously unknown in peacetime. Britain prides itself on being a free country, but under this legislation, British citizens must come to terms with the fact that, whether or not you're an enemy of the state, Big Brother really is watching you.